Do you find yourself drowning in rubbish on your Facebook or Twitter feed? Well, this has well and truly been the age of fake news, as Donald Trump would put it. Matthew D'Ancona talks about his book, Posttruth.
You're listening to The Political Book Show.
Today I'm joined by author Matthew D'Ancona, who's the author of Posttruth, The New War on Truth and How to Fight Back. Thanks for joining me, Matthew.
Pleasure.
Okay, so what is this post-truth and why are we in an era of post-truth?
Well, I think what happened initially was that people were very startled both by the Brexit decision last year and by the election of Trump. So I think the initial cause of, if you like, the post-truth panic was those two political events. And post-truth was the word of the year for Oxford dictionaries, and they defined it loosely as a situation where emotional factors play a bigger part than facts and evidence in people's decision-making. And that's a pretty good starting place for post-truth, because post-truth isn't about lying or falsehood or mendacity. Those things have always existed in human communication, and they always will. The idea of post-truth is that they cease to matter quite as much as they used to. And we start to seek narratives and ideas and claims that resonate with us emotionally, rather than that we think to be true.
You say, emotion is reclaiming its primacy, and that, the 20th century you call the age of therapy. So how does that relate to post-truth?
Well, therapy, I think, is part of of course, all these phenomena like post-truth or anything else have immediate causes and deep causes. Now, the therapy revolution of the 20th century was unquestionably and remains a good thing. Brings a lot of relief to people who are suffering, and it has transformed our understanding of the human mind and how to treat a whole range of problems and difficulties. But it also has had a side effect upon culture, and one of those side effects is that there's a tendency to find emotional explanations in almost every single situation we're in, and that can be harmless or benign. You might look at the reaction to the death of Diana and say that didn't actually do any harm to anyone, but it can also be a dangerous force, as I think it has been in America, where Trump has been able to ignite and take advantage of some pretty dark and unpleasant racist instincts, and this has led to a great division in an already pretty polarized country. Of course, emotions have a huge role to play in daily life and in politics and in commerce and everything, and one wouldn't want the world to be arid and dry and void of feeling. But it's very important when you're making rational decisions, or decisions you consider to be rational, to be aware of the part emotion is playing. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that in that constant balance between evidence and emotion is probably taking too great a part.
I suppose, I know it's a cliche to criticise, but it's kind of indicative of the way that kind of therapeutic language has entered our vocabulary, is that, safe space and trigger warnings, these would have probably started out, in a therapy room, and it's more in our vernacular now. You talk about the financial crisis being a pivotal moment. Why is that?
Yes. Well, I think that there are two big things that have enabled post-truth to become a serious issue. The first is a massive decline of trust in our institutions. And you can look at specific things like in the UK, the parliamentary expenses scandal and the hacking scandal that caused so much damage to my own trade, print media. But I think that the mother of all institutional collapses was the 2008-9 collapse of the economic system, which was narrowly averted by huge bailouts around the world for which the taxpayer paid. And I think this had a massive effect upon people's trust in the institutions that were meant to bring order to their lives.
Sure. And it wasn't really predicted as well. That was a great criticism.
Exactly.
There was a lot of boosterism and so on.
The elites that were meant to be presiding over this globalized order simply hadn't seen it coming, or if they had seen it coming, had assumed that the taxpayers of individual nation states would bail them out. It's even worse. And so I think that we underestimated our peril, the fact that still plays a huge part in people's distrust of institutions and their antipathy towards them. Now, that wouldn't matter if it weren't for the fact that we need institutions of all sorts. They're kind of our guardrails in a society. They're not the only part of society by any means, but they are important. And when no one trusts anything, which is an exaggeration, but not a total exaggeration, you get to the point that the information flow gets clogged up and anything goes. And so, to take it away from politics for a minute, you see now a tremendous amount of nonsense and pseudoscience flooding its way into the world of health and public health. They're becoming a real problem, say, with vaccinations, to take one example, or people declining really important life-saving cancer treatments because they don't trust the medical profession. I think the other thing, of course, related to that is that the digital revolution, which is, to my mind, the biggest revolution in the history of technology, has completely transformed the way we communicate with each other and the way information works. And that's, again, it's a good thing. I mean, it's democratized the information flow. It's made it possible for everyone to have a say and for people to contact people at almost zero cost around the world. And that can only be a good thing. But it's also encouraged people to cluster together in their tribes, in their echo chambers. And the algorithms that drive our social media, all the social media that we use, are designed to drive us towards people and news like ourselves. So whereas, in fact, the internet ought to be this great playground of information where we can find out all sorts of new things all the time, what in practice it does is it encourages us in our existing prejudices and intuitions. And this is a very important factor in political decision making and in our attitudes to things like climate change, and even if you want to go to the really dark side, things like Holocaust denial, which has been massively turbocharged by digitalization.
Just to get back to you're talking about fake news and these websites. Can the traditional media complain about fake news websites when there's so much reliance in the traditional media, like on income from advertorials and native content? I know you mentioned the health sector there. I was talking to someone who wrote for Science magazine, and they're constantly, approached by companies, not to say, because you can't advertise pharmaceutical products, but here is a person who used such and such a drug, and they're a lot better now, and there's a kind of blurring of the lines even within traditional media, about what is purely factual true and what is kind of advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't acquit traditional media of these problems at all. I think the first thing to say is that we've started to use fake news too broadly. I mean, Donald Trump uses it to refer to anything he disagrees with. But let's define fake. I define fake news as content that is devised, knowing it to be false for commercial or political gain. Now, that's clearly a problem. You're right that the print media have to clean their house too, because there is blurring of the boundaries with advertorial. It needs to be very, very much more clearly labeled. And I think you're right also that there's always the problems of conflicts of interest when people are lent on not to put things in an unfavorable light. These are not new problems. The thing about fake news, though, is that you have people who are actually factories of lies with a specific objective in mind, either to get money from clickbait or to, as we've seen in the case of the presidential election last year, to influence the electoral process. It's a question of scale. So I would never in a million years acquit the traditional media of these problems. But I think the fake news issue is different in scale and has to be treated as such.
Can you talk about post-truth in Trump's election?
Yes. Well, I think that what he did was to construct a kind of an approach to campaigning that no one had ever really seen. He was up against someone who was probably the most
well-funded,
most qualified candidate in presidential history. She may not have been the most charismatic, but in terms of her job, her job history, it's hard to see how she could have been topped. She knew how the White House worked from 8 years of living there. She'd been a senator and a secretary of state. She knew the system intimately and had some great ideas. Trump was a reality TV star and hotel tycoon. Now, on paper, that ought to be a walk in the park for Hillary Clinton. But what Trump did was he changed the terms of trade in a way that caught everyone off guard. He stopped worrying about a kind of evidence-based approach to choosing between candidates, which was almost, here's my CV, what about yours? And he went around looking for issues where he could attribute blame, stir up anger, propose easy solutions, use slogans like "Make America Great Again." He was very, very good at taking something like the general sense among white Americans that they were getting a poor deal and turning it into hatred against Mexican immigrants. He was very good in talking about Islamic issues. He was very good at talking about the wall. He was amazing at turning the disaster of his remarks about grabbing women into somehow a fight back against political correctness, things no one had ever done before. Now, to those of us who found this deplorable, this was further evidence that he simply wasn't suited to the job. But what he actually was doing was cutting through the normal processes of political decision making and using particularly social media to get straight to people and to fire into their emotional responses with the help of a few people like Steve Bannon and others. And the key there was that really the evidence wasn't the key, it was the feeling. After he won, one of his senior assistants, Kellyanne Conway, used this wonderful phrase, alternative facts,
yes,
in interview. And I think that kind of captured the essence of Trumpism, really, which is if you don't like the reality you're presented with, you just insist upon another. And it's funny, but it's also terrifying because this is the guy with the nuclear codes. He's by far the most powerful person in the world. And he treats reality as one would a meal at a buffet. If you don't like the facts as they are, choose another one. And that is really new terrain for a president. There have been corrupt presidents in the past. There have been bad presidents. But there's never been one who's had this kind of very, very slippery relationship with truth. There have been liars, but not like this. It's a very new phenomenon.
Why have people kind of revolted against the kind of, I suppose, like formality, or maybe they see it as like the stuffiness of Hillary Clinton's campaign? There doesn't seem to be this sense that presidents should act presidential and restraint is a good thing. A lot of Trump supporters, a lot of them actually don't particularly like Trump as a person, but they find his manner refreshing, that, they associate that, his impulsiveness is truthfulness.
I think you're spot on to use the word stuffiness. I think that every era has a shift and its own culture. And one of the shifts of culture in the early 21st century is a general abhorrence of those who claim to be better than others. And actually, I think that's a good thing. I like the democratization of society and culture.
Sure.
I don't like the elitism that you see, where people who are in positions of authority assume they are also better than the people they represent. They're doing completely separate things, in my view. If you have a position of power, that's fine, and as long as it's legitimate, but it doesn't make you a better person. And I think that what you call stuffiness is bang on, because there was about and is about Hillary a kind of aristocratic manner, and I think people were put off by that because she sort of buzzed and hummed with a knowledge that she was better qualified than anyone in the world to do the job, whereas Trump came across as someone who was a kind of living embodiment of the anger of those who felt left out.
Sure.
And actually, that was much more in tune with the zeitgeist. And I think there are lessons in this which have nothing to do with left or right, about how politicians, but not just politicians, people in positions of authority have to comport themselves. Look at Corbyn in the general election in the UK and how successful he was simply by behaving in an ordinary and unguarded fashion. No spin.
I remember the Grenfell Towers. I know that was a big thing on the internet, between the contrast between Theresa May, was portrayed as distant.
Yeah, Theresa May turned up and didn't talk to victims. Corbyn turned up and was hugging victims and talking to them. It may be a small thing, but symbolically it's massive, because it shows that one person is defined by her office and the other is defined by the needs of the moment. And clearly that was a massively emotional and difficult and tragic moment. And Corbyn got the fact that what was required at that moment was simple empathy. And the shots of the Prime Minister standing aside with her security team couldn't have been worse. Whatever she was actually doing in practice, whatever measures she was taking to rectify what had gone wrong, were eclipsed by those images, which were terribly damaging, I think, to her.
Just to talk about, back on Trump's election again, would you consider Russian Facebook ads and, comments from sock puppet accounts, are these a form of post-truth, or is that something else entirely?
It's related to it. I think that what you see there is the very clever use of digital technology to manipulate people's emotions in a way they're not necessarily fully aware of. We're still, I think, in the foothills of finding out what precisely the extent of it was, but it would seem that data scraped off our social media feeds was being used by, let's say, at the very least, forces associated with the Russian government to intervene in the electoral process. Now, the difficulty is it's very hard to track what sort of advertising was being fired into individual accounts, because you're talking about millions of voters, and it will take a lot of research to find out, who exactly got what. But there's no doubt that this changes the game of political advertising and manipulation completely. And again, the regulation, the legislation in America, but also in this country, is just totally out of date. The relevant laws around this in the UK were passed in 2000, and that was 4 years before the creation of Facebook. So one of the key tasks in all of this is for government to think very hard about how, and legislators, and not just in the UK, across Europe and in the world, how they're going to deal with this. I don't want to see a great regime of censorship. The last thing I want to see is a ministry of truth. The absolute worst outcome to all of this would be a ministry of truth in each country deciding what is or isn't true. That would be disastrous. But I do think we're going to have to think long and hard about how we regulate these this incredible new technology, because it has power that at the moment has almost no confines at all.
I remember I was talking to someone else actually in a different interview, and she made an interesting point. Like, what if Mark Zuckerberg were to run for president tomorrow? You know, think of the news reach you'd automatically have, you know, just with one company.
He would dwarf. I mean, but we were all very exercised about Berlusconi being running Italy when he was also running its media. This would be dwarfed by Zuckerberg. You know, and I think by the way, he's seriously contemplating.
Yeah, he's made some comments in that kind of direction.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely.
What makes something a conspiracy theory? What is the dividing line?
Well, some conspiracy theories are true in the sense that there are conspiracy theories and they need to be uncovered. It still seems more likely than not that there was some form of conspiracy in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and we've had a whole raft of new information fueling those ideas in the last few days. And there was a conspiracy in the Watergate scandal. So you can't dismiss them all. But I think in the context of post-truth, what we understand by conspiracy theory is an attempt to see some form of secret collaboration, a malign collaboration underpinning the course of events. And the oldest of these is the most kind of adhesive is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated document that claimed that the Jews were running the world. It was entirely made up. It was produced by Russian secret police, but it had a massive impact during the 20th century. It was picked up by Hitler, by Henry Ford, and it continues to be cited to this day. At the other end, that you have people who are absolutely sure that UFOs are visiting the world and that the government's keeping it quiet. You have people who believe that we're being sprayed with chemtrails in order to keep us docile. Really, the sky's the limit. There are so many of these things now.
Do you think they're more common than they used to be?
Yes, I think that's the key point. Is that conspiracy theories have always been part of human discussion. The Illuminati, who are a very common idea in conspiracy theories, sometimes claim to be half lizard, half human, yes, have been around since the 18th century as an idea. But what's different now in the 21st is that the web enables these ideas to be proliferated, and what you find if you look at the research is that a lot more people believe conspiracy theories than used to. Why is this so? Well, first of all, because the technology is making them more widely available, but also because one of the things conspiracy theories do psychologically is that they give an order in a world of hectic change. We're all, I think, sometimes a bit baffled by what's going on. We live in a time of immense transformation and disruption. Conspiracy theories offer the sort of consolation that there's some elite behind it all, lurking in kind of Jedi robes. So
they're kind of comforting, I suppose, in a way.
Exactly. That although they may be based on the claim that the world is going to hell in a handcart, they explain why it's doing so, and it also gives the people who argue for them the sense of consolation that they found the answer. I find it intriguing, for example, that David Icke, who is a character who was laughed at when he started to present himself initially as the Messiah, but then as a kind of globe-trotting conspiracy theorist, can fill an auditorium of people and talk for 12 hours. Now that's new. That's something extremely unusual. And what I think has changed is that conspiracy theories used to mark people as cranks. If you claim that the moon landings never happened, people rolled their eyes. Now the figures are startling, and you also see that flat earthery is growing quite considerably again. I think 6% of American adults believe the Earth is flat. Now that's about 16 million people. That's 16 million voting Americans believe the Earth is flat. quite alarming.
It is. There's a breatherism as well, which is you don't need food. It's also, I think, it's kind of a bit of self-flattery as well that I can discern the real truth behind the curtain.
Exactly. I mean, you always look for power and who is claiming power in anything like this, which is behind every conspiracy theory. There's a guru who claims to have found the truth. Buy his books, sign up to his website, buy his merchandise, buy his homeopathic remedies. There is always there is almost always a scam involved. There are very few unself-interested conspiracy theorists. You often find there's a tidy little business underpinning them.
On the other side, though, obviously there's been a lot of revelations and corruption and stuff like that has made people more distrustful of politicians. But do you think, has the ship sailed on people from all political persuasions trusting like a pedigreed news outlet like the New York Times, or getting their news from a single source? Is there too much distrust for that now?
Well, I think that's the big question, and it's up to people who are involved in all bits of the media, the MSM media and all the new and exciting forms of media that are proliferating around it, to ask themselves how they are going to be trusted sources in 10 years' time. Because in the end, that's what we do. That's what media is there for. It's there to what it actually offers the public is trust. The public will only come to these sources in the end if they trust them. And so I think that there's a growing realization that trust has been lost and it must be recovered. Now, that won't stop the sites that specialize in fake news from specializing in fake news. But I think that what you're seeing in maybe some of the mainstream media brands is a recognition that we'll have to up our game. I mean, after all, when I started journalism in 1991, there were a handful of television channels and there were newspapers which were printed on printing presses, and that was it. And now we have this incredible information ecosphere, which is mostly digital, print still there, holding on, mainstream broadcasting, but the convergence is all digital, and it's digital is flat. Everyone is competing on even terms in the sense that they all have to compete for people's attention. The most valuable commodity in the modern world is attention, and so the challenge for media is how do you get people's attention without behaving in a way that sacrifices their trust? So you get people's trust by providing reliable information and analysis. But you get their attention in the first place by doing something that no one else is doing. And the difficulty will be figuring out how to do both, how to keep people's interest, but also to provide them with the kind of things that make them want to come back for the right reasons, and because it gives them the stuff they need to be citizens as well as entertained individuals. To
kind of, what I think you're kind of getting at there, is it elitist to say that if people prefer the over-the-top news on Facebook, can we really say, no, you shouldn't be reading this, you should be reading...
No, I don't think... I mean, look, I've worked most of my professional career in what's still called rather grandly by some people the quality press. But I very strongly dislike this idea that people who read celebrity magazines are somehow to be deplored. Why on earth should they be? It's a free country. You're allowed to read what you like. I like Geordie Shore. I don't see why. I think that one of the most dispiriting things, and I think it's very strong in England, is this almost classist a way of dividing media. That certain people read this paper, certain people watch this program, certain people listen to this. That's a very bad way of looking at it.
Is it in danger of, the quality press? Is it going to turn into something like, say, what classical music is today? It's seen as this kind of niche interest of, it's not really popular.
That's what it has to. That's what it has to avoid becoming.
Yeah.
What it has to do is find a way of being appealing without sacrificing its core values. I think that's a real challenge, and I actually think I'm optimistic. I think it's an exciting one. There are doomsayers who say it can't be done. I don't see why that's the case. I think there's a different generation of people arising. Actually, I think they've been around for quite a while, of people who are just as versed in pop culture as they are in what's going on in Parliament, and want both. And why not? I'm not remotely bothered by that. I don't think there's any problem about people caring simultaneously about whether Theresa May's government is falling apart and on what's going on in Strictly. I just think that it's a false dichotomy endlessly to agonize about the two, and it doesn't lead us anywhere. I also think, by the way, that podcasting has a huge role to play in all this, because one of the problems with traditional media is that it's very formatted. And in public service broadcasting, it has to be, because there has to be impartiality and there has to be balance and so on. The great thing about podcasting is that it's both fresh and intelligent, but it isn't as formatted as some of the more traditional forms. And I find when I'm talking to younger audiences that a lot of them start with podcasts. That's their starting point. They go to podcasts to find out what else they should be examining. It's almost as if podcasts have become their kind of guide, their manual to how to deal with the rest of the media. I think this is a very positive development, because I look at I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think that they're kind of, I call them somewhere the punk Socratic dialogue. They've taken the ancient idea of the dialogue, and they've given it a modern edge. And I think that I have a hunch that podcasts may be the kind of the salvation of the whole ecology, because they navigate us between all the different bits of the media, and they're not hidebound. They're not so clenched and stuck within this kind of very traditional inherited format. And that's all to the good. That's why digital technology is so thrilling, because it contains within itself usually the answers to the problems it creates.
You mentioned earlier, the laws have not really caught up with this new world of social media. And, you also said there that, say, an organisation like the BBC, they're quite hidebound. There's a huge manual on what they can say, what they can't say, to ensure balance. I know the print press is not quite as constrained, but can the traditional news outlets compete with online? Because libel laws are more likely to be enforced with newspapers. So for example, the recent instance of, there was a spreadsheet going around with sexual harassment allegations following Weinstein. That could not be published in a traditional press outlet, but if people wanted to see it, they could just go online. So is the traditional press always going to be one-upped or always going to be scooped by online outlets because they're not as afraid of libel law?
The main problem is that there is a big gap between the way in which, if you like, the tech giants and the traditional publishing houses are treated, and that's going to be a problem which politicians and legislators are going to have to address. It's ridiculous, for example, that Facebook is treated as a platform, like a software, rather than a publisher. It may be that we need to find a new category to describe platforms like Facebook, as they like to style themselves, if they're not going to be full-blown publishers. But certainly there has to be a degree of liability. for social media companies that are proliferating things daily on a massive scale. And that's not just to save the feelings or the future of the mainstream media. It's also for reasons of justice, because it can't be right that citizens and other interests are protected from libel and defamation, but on old media, but not on new. And we really need to come to a whole grand new settlement, I think, on this. And you can see the stirrings of this. There are parliamentary inquiries going on in the UK. The Germans are regulating quite hard. There's a lot of resistance from the tech giants, but they are, I think, aware that the party is over, in the sense that the period of about 10 or 15 years when they could do what they wanted is coming to a close, because people have suddenly woken up to the fact that their world is dominated by 4 or 5 companies that are essentially unrestrained and uncontrolled. So my hunch is that in the next 10 years, you'll see, I hope, the best way of doing it would be on a global basis, to have some sort of charter to which all countries signed up. The more likely outcome is that you get a bitsy nation-by-nation approach, which is much less satisfactory. But it certainly has to be done.
I know the EU would probably make, obviously the member states conform to whatever rules. I was just, should traditional media, do you think that should resemble social media more, or should it be vice versa? So in other words, do you think it should be tougher libel laws on Facebook, or less tough libel laws with, I'll call it the real world, with, print and TV?
Well, I always have a presumption in favour of free speech. That's been one of the dominant forces of my life, my journalism. So I always incline towards publication. But on the other hand, you have to protect people from defamation and libel and so on. I think there should be a level playing field. And what's certainly true is that the old-fashioned idea that you could print something in Germany but not in the UK, or you could print something in Uzbekistan but not in America, doesn't mean anything anymore, because once anything is printed anywhere, it's available everywhere. And that's one of the big things about the digitalization of the planet, is it has made it a planet. Nation states may not like that, but it's the reality. People are in communication with each other all the time, and if the thing is going to be in any way regulated and ordered, it's going to involve cooperation between nations. Another reason why Brexit is so stupid.
What is postmodernism?
That's a good question.
It's a small question with a long answer, but as quickly, as briefly as you can.
Well, I like David Foster Wallace's answer to that, which was anything after modernism, which is my favourite evasive answer, but it's not quite true. Postmodernism essentially is based on the proposition that the world is shaped by narratives rather than truths, and therefore the things that we claim to be true are just expressions of power relations. And some good things came out of it. For example, I think that without the postmodern moment in France, which really is over now, but was very much a force in the last quarter of the 20th century, there wouldn't have been quite so much energy behind some of the ethnic minority movements, the feminist movement, the LGBT movement, because it gave those groups a sense that they could control language and reclaim terminology, and that they didn't have to be defined by the language that was handed to them by the order in which they lived. And that's a good thing. The bad thing is when it becomes relativism, and it simply amounts to anything goes, nothing is true, and you can say what you like. And that's actually a very dangerous and potentially fascistic approach to the world, because that's exactly what people who are fascists want to be the case, where there's no grounding in truth and They simply define reality through power. The implications of postmodernism for the post-truth era are very much a matter of dispute. What I would say is this, that I don't think for a minute that Donald Trump sits up late at night in the White House or Mar-a-Lago plowing his way through French texts by Derrida and Foucault. Okay, that's not happening.
Not reclaim.
But I think that he is an unwitting beneficiary of a world in which ideas always have a role, and one of the ideas that has got a grip on our culture is that truth is a shaky concept, and I think he benefited from that.
Has postmodernism been particularly attracted to the left, or does it now inform both sides' thinking?
Well, postmodernism was very much associated with the left because it was seen as a rebellion against patriarchal and authoritarian systems of power and language. But of course, in the way of ideas are like viruses. They seep out of universities and seminar rooms and into the ether of media and general discussions, and they do their work. And it's fascinating to see how a lot of the assumptions behind postmodernism are now becoming common coin. I mean, people talk about them without necessarily attributing them to the very complex texts behind them. And I think that's the real relationship between postmodernism and post-truth. A lot of academics are very defensive about this and say we shouldn't dismiss postmodernism, and indeed we shouldn't. But equally well, that shouldn't stop us from suggesting that some of its findings can be abused in the name of people who simply want to obscure the truth and empower themselves accordingly.
I suppose just to finish up, do you think, is there going to be a backlash against this idea of there is no truth, everything is relative, and is there going to be a backlash against the idea that every source is as valid as the rest?
Yes, I do, and it's already happening. You can see it in the astonishing growth of fact-checking organizations. You can see it in the remarkable number of research projects that are suddenly springing up all over the world to look into this. You can see it in collaborative ventures by charities. You can see it in classrooms. Everywhere I've gone talking about this book, you can see concern and activism happening. But what is really important is that people understand that it won't happen simply by the pendulum swinging back. There's not going to be a restoration of what went before the post-truth order. We've got to deal with the world as it is now. It is a digital world. It's a world in which we are bombarded by information as never before. And asserting the values of truth and veracity and evidence in science, and as well as politics and commercial activity and so on, is harder than it's ever been. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but what people who care about this cannot do is simply sit back and wait for the Trump presidency to pass and Brexit to pass and think everything will go back to normal. We've got to get used to the new normal, and it's an exciting challenge.
You talked a bit about just, do you think there's going to be a system on Facebook or whatever where sources are verified, or people can see, I'm thinking of Twitter, like a blue tick, but not quite that, but that this source is trusted, or a way to kind of for people to differentiate?
Well, I think that's a very important part of the solution, which is I'm a big believer in digital literacy, and I want to see children taught digital literacy from the age of 5. They're mostly taught online safety, which is great. A lot of them are learning coding, which is great, but there's not much attention paid to actually how you use the thing. And I think kite marking websites and people evaluating them and giving them scores and saying this is a trusted website, as with everything from restaurants to cinemas to plays to estate agents, everything to Uber drivers. everything is assessed and judged. We should do the same with the sources we use, and that people can help with that. And also, why shouldn't there be the equivalent of the Michelin guide to websites, or the Which Consumer's Guide to websites, so that people can actually go to the sources that are verified. If they want to go to other sources, that's fine too. But if you want to go to places that have a reputation for reliability, then let's give people those kite marks. I think that's something that you'll see happening in the very near future.
Okay, Matthew d'Ancona. The book is Post-Truth, New War on Truth and How to Fight Back. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
You're listening to The Political Book Show.